Hey everybody. This was a really fun episode with one of my favorite people on the internet, Johnny Sanphillippo, which I think you're really going to enjoy. He's a very thoughtful and very intelligent observer, I think, of reality, and offers a different perspective than what I have often heard in the professional world. One of the funny things is, as I record this piece, there was some crazy news today in Silicon Valley related to a banking collapse. And we actually touched on some related issues in this conversation about Silicon Valley, about the Bay Area, and about possible futures for that region and for California and the rest of the country. So I think you'll find this conversation timely as well. At any rate, thanks for listening as always. Enjoy. Welcome to the Mesa City podcast. I've got a wonderful guest here today. One of my favorite reads on the internet. Certainly one of the most interesting people that I correspond with occasionally, and it's Johnny Sanphillippo from the Granola Shotgun blog. Johnny, welcome.
Good to be here. And greetings from Mexico City.
Yeah, and you're actually in Mexico City. Why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us what you're doing in Mexico City?
I've been visiting Mexico City for quite some time. I have had friends here from Spain who lived in Mexico City, and increasingly Americans who have relocated here. Some part-time, some have actually gone through the immigration process and now live here full-time. I'm also getting my immigration card. That's the reason I'm here this time. That's not like I'm leaving the States, but I like having the option of coming here because it's actually a fabulous place.
Yeah, I've not really spent any time there, but it's been on my short list for a very long time. Had a number of friends tell me it's really one of the most interesting cities in North America.
Yeah, it really is. It's a great place, and the weather is amazing. I mean, people always picture Mexico as a hot, dry desert landscape, or if you go farther south, then it becomes like a tropical jungle. Right. Mexico City is in the sweet spot. It's Honolulu all the time.
All right. Well, you're selling me on it, so it's definitely going to make the list. Hopefully sometime within the next year. We're looking at it. So I'd love to actually get the kids down there sometime too, and see how they would react to being in a city.
It's a great place. Good food, nice people, good weather, lots of good urbanism. I mean, that's one of the big attractions. Is if you're in the right part of the city, the older part. It's everybody walks everywhere. There's bike lanes everywhere. And it's just it's a gracious, lovely place to live.
Wonderful. So, Johnny, I'm not. I was thinking earlier today. I'm not even sure when I first became aware of you or your site. It's certainly been several years, probably at least 5 or 6 years. How did you come to? Why don't you talk a little bit about what your site is, what Granola Shotgun is, and how did you come to writing that site to begin with?
Like a lot of people who start a blog, I was firstly trying to clarify my thoughts for myself by putting them into words and pictures, and partly it was like therapy. Like I needed to vent about some of this stuff, and then evidently enough people stumbled on it, probably by accident, that I started to interact with Chuck Marohn and the Strong Towns people and Congress for New Urbanism and Urban 3 and the Incremental Development Alliance. And I wound up sort of going around the country to all these conferences and meetings and just exploring all these different places, to see what they're like. And I thought that I was going to learn how we can build more of the kind of places that I love by going to people who are a lot smarter than I am, because I have no credentials. I have no certificates, no stamps, none of that. I'm just kind of like a flunky who's like intensely curious about this stuff. And I thought, if I could surround myself by all these like interesting, smart, the engineers and the architects and the public officials and who actually do this stuff for a living, people pay them to do this stuff. I would figure out like how I could do it myself, or at least how to understand more how they're doing it. And what I discovered over the last 10 or 15 years is that it's really, really hard, and most people fail at it. And they fail at it because we live in a society that doesn't really want any of this stuff. And it's very frustrating. And part of my journey with the blog was to confront reality head on and to let go of a lot of the, oh, wouldn't it be nice? Like, no, it's not going to be nice. We're not going to do that. We're going to do something else. And you can either, keep banging your head up against a wall, or you could learn how you can achieve your goals by other means. And I think that's really where I've come to with the blog and in my own life. Like, you can't go to some cookie cutter suburban subdivision with the 8-lane arterial lined with Jiffy Lubes and McDonald's and then turn that into Paris. That's not going to happen. You have to let go of that stuff, right? Um, it's more like if you're going to live in a suburban environment, which can work, you have to embrace it on its own terms and do the things that you can do within those parameters, right?
Yeah. So
Or
it's
you can simply choose to live someplace else.
yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of us kind of in the field even struggle with that. And I'm one of those people that has worked in the field a long time and been, I'm an architect, I'm an urban designer, and done a lot of planning and writing zoning codes and all that sort of stuff. And so I'm one of those types of people that you're referring to. And it was interesting to me when I first started reading your blog. I think I was attracted to it because, first of all, the storytelling is really, really good. Um, Not just the writing, but the way you use photography on the site and everything else. But also just the fact that there was a perspective that within the professions and within the field that we don't often hear or talk about very much. That was, in a certain sense, it's like getting a dose of tough love for people, which I think is helpful. And so as you talked about your own exploration, it's been interesting as I read and digest what you've written. It's affected my own exploration of a lot of these issues. And I think one of the things that a recurring theme that you talk about is uh, really related to how your perspective of how the future may go, especially related to suburbia and American cities, is really different from the narrative that a lot of us in the professions would like to put forward about what could happen or what might happen. So I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit and just, how you see American cities and suburbia likely changing based on what you've seen and what you've experienced.
So I I see most of what we build in North America, at least since World War II, since the suburban thing really started to kick in at scale, is that we build disposable places. We build places that are kind of shiny and new for about 20 or 30 or 40 years, and then they age, and then they decline. And they decline subtly in ways that people can't quite understand because it's like the typical 1950s tract home suburb. The houses were quite small. They had two, maybe three bedrooms, one bathroom, and uh, they aged together, and they became less desirable for people who had a little bit more money and wanted a bigger house, and they wanted nicer neighbors with more money. And so there was this migration away from those original suburbs toward newer, shinier places that had more bells and whistles and they were more prestigious and stuff. And what that did is it created a vacuum behind where poorer people would fill in the older suburban neighborhoods. And the reaction is, oh, that used to be a nice place, but then the wrong element moved in and they ruined it. But actually, it went into decline first. That's why poorer people could afford it. They couldn't have afforded it otherwise, right? And while that was happening, the pipes and the road networks and all of the infrastructure started to decline because a pipe will last for a certain amount of time, and after 50, 60 years, you got to dig it up and you have to replace it, just like you have to replace all the windows and all the houses and all the roofs and all the furnaces. And the maintenance costs on a municipal level outstrips the revenue. And that's when things really get funky. You wind up with the, like, why can't Flint, Michigan afford its water treatment plant? Like it seemed like, oh, all the wrong people moved in and they destroyed the place, but actually it was failing anyway. Um, because we don't allow older suburbs to mature, that means they become more intensely used. You take the little houses and you put up a bigger thing on that same piece of land. We don't allow that. It means that there's really no way to add value, to generate more revenue, to deal with the maintenance. And at the same time, all the school teachers, all the police, all the firefighters, they all have these accumulated legacy costs. All the pensions and all the healthcare expenses roll in, and they accumulate just when the revenue is dropping. And it's just so what you do is that the people who can afford to, they move to the next new place. But then you've got the 1970s era suburban subdivisions that they begin to age. So then you got to move to the 1990s uh, neighborhoods. And like I was born in Los Angeles, but I spent a big chunk of my growing up years in suburban New Jersey. And if I look around at all the people that I went to high school with, the majority of them didn't just migrate to a newer suburb in New Jersey. They moved to North Carolina, they moved to Texas, they moved to Florida because they were resetting the clock. Okay, it's all new infrastructure, no legacy pension costs for the municipalities, right? And it's just like the clock is ticking. It's just going to be a point where they're all going to become less valuable and the maintenance bills are going to come due. So it's a slash and burn kind of urbanism, right?
Yeah, and it's
Uh,
interesting. So I think as you talk about that, it reminds me of one of the pieces you wrote a while back where you talked about the sort of the different eras of like American infrastructure, and we have this pattern within us where there is a form of infrastructure that becomes dominant and takes hold, and probably is created and subsidized to some extent by different levels of society and government. And then after a time, we don't really try to fix that infrastructure. We just create the next one and move on. And I always thought that was kind of fascinating because you went pretty far back in American history to detail some of that. But um, I think that probably impacts how you see a lot of American suburbia too, doesn't it?
So my mother-in-law was born in a small town in central Nebraska, and it was actually the farm that her great-grandfather homesteaded after the Civil War. He was from Pennsylvania, and at the end of the Civil War, one of the ways that the federal government tried to like hold things together was saying, okay, it doesn't matter whether you were from the north or the south, you now have the opportunity. Once we clear the undesirables from the territory, of course, you get all this free land. All you have to do is stick a flag in the dirt and build a sod hut or log cabin and stay there for a few years and make it productive. And then the federal government will give you this land for free. And that was an enormous subsidy from the federal government. And if you were in that town in 1880 or 1900 or 1920, it would be growing, it would be flourishing. There was a lot of activity going on in these little country towns, and the farms were all doing really well. But at a certain point, all the rules got changed because the federal government changed its policies. And what the federal government did is it said, okay, we're going to do this new thing now. We're not interested in family farms. We've already settled the territory. We've already established that this is now America, and it's not whatever was there before. That's gone. We're not doing that anymore. Um, and the subsidies and the attention suddenly went to industrial cities, and all the small towns and all the family farms emptied out because we had new policies. So like we don't want little artisanal farms with like 7 cows and 10 pigs, and 100 acres of corn. We want industrial agriculture. We want this to scale up. You want to get big or you want to get out. And at the same time, the jobs were opening up in the factories in Chicago and Pittsburgh and whatnot, manufacturing, and all the young people got vacuumed up into the cities. And for some people, that was great. They preferred that. They didn't want to be stuck on the farm. Other people would have preferred to live in the country, but the economics didn't work anymore. Uh, and everything just tipped. And the little town that my mother-in-law grew up in, the conversation when we go back there, are there 29 people or 31 people left? And everyone is 85 years old. And I asked them, what's going to happen, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? People just shrug. I don't know. So there's going to be like the countryside depopulated. And it didn't just happen in America, it happened everywhere. So then we had the next thing was Detroit. It boomed. Like Detroit went from this tiny place in around 1900 to one of the biggest, richest cities in the world. And it peaked around 1950, 1955. And then it just had this relentless decline. And it wasn't just Detroit. It was Cleveland and it was Youngstown and it was all these places because we had federal policies that built up these places, you know. And then we decided, okay, we're not doing the industrial cities anymore. Now we're doing this next thing. Now we're doing suburbia. And everybody's going to leave the cities and they're going to go live out in the cul-de-sacs and the strip malls. And we're going to subsidize that. And you know what? Just like the farms dried up and died, our industrial city centers just evaporated, right? And I always say, I love Detroit. I think it's a great place for all sorts of interesting reasons. But big chunks of it look like Berlin in 1945. I mean, there wasn't a war, but there might as well have been from what's left. And I think we're now at the point where this suburban thing, which is massively subsidized through all sorts of federal programs, is coming toward the end of its cycle. Because we can't keep doing this forever. Because they're just natural limits, they're economic limits, there's all kinds of stuff, and it's going to have to change. And it can reinvent itself, or it can fail. And I think we're going to see both of those things happen. Like some industrial cities reinvented themselves. Chicago, New York, San Francisco. There was a time when buying a house in San Francisco cost the same as a house in Youngstown, Ohio, right? But they diverged. They took different paths. Different things happened for all sorts of reasons. It doesn't matter. I think that a lot of the suburbs that we built were in marginal places. They were never meant to last, really. I mean, it was all a very short-term kind of thing. And we're going to see them get reinvented somehow. And I don't know what that looks like. And I don't spend a lot of time worrying about that because it's not, I mean, I'll be dead. That's the short version. Also, these are not places I care about and they're not places that I live. So it doesn't bother me at all if they thrive or fail on their own terms. That's okay with me. It's not my fight.
So I want to come back to this, but that point, the story you told actually led me to another question, something I've been thinking about a lot lately. But so you're a San Franciscan now. You've been living in the city for what, 30 years?
Since the mid 90s. So it's been getting under 30 years now. So 25 and so, yeah.
So I think your point about Detroit was sort of like king of the world in 1950 is totally true, and it's obvious. And it was an immensely wealthy city. You can still see those remnants when you go downtown and see the incredible buildings and facilities that were built in that era and before. I've thought really for about the last couple of years that it feels like San Francisco 2020 is like the peak San Francisco because of the immense impact and influence of Silicon Valley and all of the incredible wealth that's generated in Silicon Valley. And I wonder, you've been there long enough. You've seen this trajectory. It was already obviously a successful city in the 1990s, but it has taken to new heights since then. How do you perceive that? I mean, is it something where you could see a curve where 50 years from now we look back and we think that 2020 was about the peak of wealth and influence for the Bay Area?
I think the tech industry is having the same bell-shaped curve as the auto industry. That there was a young startup industry, lots of speculation, lots of money flowing in. A lot of people made a huge amount of money. These tech companies have a lot of influence. But what I've watched over the years is that the things that used to take 200 people to do, now one person does it, right? The automation is becoming automated. Right, like that. It's like you got robots making other robots, kind of in there, but within this. And I'm in no way an expert, but I just know that a lot of companies peak and then they decline. The pieces get broken up. It's sort of like when you used to build a car, you built the whole car in Detroit, and then they realized, wait a minute, why don't we start making some of the pieces in Mississippi and Alabama because it's cheaper? Then we'll just assemble the parts in Detroit. And they're like, wait a minute, why don't we assemble them in in China or Mexico, where it's just so much cheaper, right? And we don't have all those burdensome labor unions and all environmental rules. We don't need that. And then what you realize is that there's more cars in the world than ever, but they're not made anywhere in particular. They're just everywhere, right? And I think tech has already gone well down that road. You see the people who run the companies living in very desirable parts of the Bay Area, in Marin and in San Francisco and in some of the the wine country kind of thing. And the middle management is in nice places, but they're scattering them out. And then there's the actual workers who are working from anywhere in Malaysia, and because there's talent in Iceland, why don't we just hire 7 people in Iceland to do this for us, And again, tech is going to be everywhere and nowhere. And what that means for San Francisco is that the fire hose of money is slowing down. And when you have an unlimited amount of money coming into your town, you can make a lot of mistakes, and it's okay. But when you get back to an actual normal amount of revenue, right, then you have to do things more carefully. And San Francisco is struggling with that because we didn't have to think too hard before, and now we actually do. So yeah, and I think that 50 years from now, San Francisco might be in the same shape it was 50 years ago. See, this is the thing that people aren't paying attention to. The reason that there was the Summer of Love and all the hippies and all the Janis Joplin and is that it was so cheap. San Francisco was an incredibly cheap city.
Right.
There were all these big, half-abandoned Victorian mansions everywhere. Nobody wanted them. You couldn't give those things away because the city had basically, the middle classes had decanted to the suburbs, right? And the core of the city was left in a shell condition. And it provided a tremendous opportunity for people who weren't obsessed about the school district, who had a high tolerance for weirdos, to colonize it and to create a whole new culture. Because San Francisco was a very conservative place in the 1950s, right? It was mostly Irish and Italians with huge families, and they were like strict Catholics, and it was like a cartoon of a certain kind of working class ethnic city where all the cops were Irish and that kind of thing, and they left, and it allowed a whole other subculture to emerge there. So it could be that 50 years from now, San Francisco is in worse shape in a lot of ways, like financially or whatnot, but it could be actually like a really cool place. Like, can you believe that in 1887 somebody built this massive mansion? And then it went into decline. And then, like in 2020, somebody spent all this money. This .com crazy person spent $1 billion fixing it up, and now it's kind of like this creaky old ruin, and we get to live in it for $19 a month. It's amazing. Like I can see that working out, and that might be facilitated by an earthquake. I'm just saying.
Yeah, who knows?
This is how things happen.
Yeah. You've also, I think one of the things you've also been really eloquent in talking about is when you talk about San Francisco and you talk about California in general, and then you compare it to the places you travel, you've been pretty quick to take on like the so-called Texas, miracle, and talk about how really other parts of the country are on the same exact trajectory as California, and that California is really just early. And maybe it got there faster just because of the unbelievable growth that happened in a short period of time in the state.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent time in Texas, and there are definitely neighborhoods in Dallas and stuff that I could live in if I had to. I could find a place in Texas that I'd be happy living in. Not my first choice, but what they're doing is they're having their explosive growth moment. Like they have a lot of flat, cheap land, and they can just keep building. It's not like there's a mountain or an ocean that they're going to bump into. Which is one of California's problems, is that there's actually 2 Californias. There's a thin ribbon along the coast, and then there's everything else. Mm-hmm. And you don't, I sound like a snob when I say this, but if you're in the interior, it is so hot and dry in the summer and dusty, right? And it's kind of damp and cold and gray in the winter. Like the whole point of being in California is you want to be where the weather is nice, where the scenery is nice. That's where the culture and the money and the good jobs are all clustered up. And you don't want to be in the middle of nowhere. You want to be where the weather is nice, where the scenery is nice, where the scenery is nice, where the culture and the money and the good jobs are all clustered up. And you don't want to be in the middle of nowhere. You want to be where the weather is nice, where the scenery is nice, where the culture and the money and the good jobs are all clustered up. And if you're going to live in the interior, if you're going to live in Bakersfield or Fresno or Redding or something like that, you might as well move to Texas and save yourself a whole lot of money. Texas is going to grow and grow and grow and grow until it bleeds to death, because all that infrastructure, all the roads, all the pipes, and they really like to spread out big in Texas. And there's no way that the tax revenue from the things that they're building is going to be able to pay for replacing all that infrastructure when it ages, right? And then you're going to have those same choices, right? Do you abandon it because it's not worth fixing at this point? The town doesn't have the money to fix the pipes and the roads. And the individual homeowners are going to be like, well, I got money. Do I want to spend it doing this, or do I want to move to some new place that's better? And what better will be like in the future is up to other people to decide. They'll have a different attitude than we do because there'll be different priorities in the future, right? Or maybe a place is worth saving, but then you have to figure out how to make things cash flow. I mean, it really is a capitalist kind of thing. Like, if you don't have enough tax revenue to pay for the roads or the pipes, your business has failed. That's bankruptcy, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to figure out, how do you generate more value on your place to pay for the underlying stuff, right? Like, if you look at anything that was built 500 years ago, there was a concentration. There was a town. It was all clustered tight together, surrounded by farmland. Right? There's a reason they did that. It wasn't because they didn't want to spread out. They had no choice. The resources were not there, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because as part of our back and forth over the years in talking about these things, we come to realize that fundamentally there's not a whole lot different in how a city such as mine, Kansas City, or a city in Texas, or a city in California, or a city on the East Coast, how they are fundamentally planned, built, financed, designed. They are, we more or less have a national system. The infrastructure funding is pretty similar from place to place. There are little tweaks here and there that are different. The planning formula is really pretty similar. There are some places that have much stronger planning laws and some that have weaker planning laws, but fundamentally it's a system built around, land use zoning that is pretty consistent across the country. And it's just that there are, a lot of different cities that have different impacts, whether it's a geographic impact that puts a limit on them, or high growth versus no growth at all. And so, it really is a case where some cities and places really just seem to feel the effects earlier than others. And even like my city now, we're starting to get to that point because we're growing again, that we're starting to have a lot of those discussions that feel like discussions that probably took place in San Francisco 20 years ago.
One of the things that you mentioned in your introductory podcast, where you were like explaining what the Messy City was going to be about, is you wanted to offer people glimpses into potential solutions.
Yeah.
Right? Like, okay, so we've defined the problem. Now what do we do about it? Mm-hmm. Right? And I kind of want to get into that.
Let's do it.
That interests me.
Yeah.
And one of this quote solutions, and I don't believe there are solutions. I think that there are situations that have to be endured. I don't think you're going to fix this, because like when you say solution, it means everything can stay just the way it is, right? And I'm like, no, that's not on the table. We're going to have to do things differently. What does that look like? And I kind of put some of those things into practice in my own life. Like, I have to preface all of this. People hear that I live in San Francisco and they immediately think like coastal elite, billionaire kind of thing. And I'm like, okay, I am a housekeeper, a gardener, a house painter, a handyman, right? So that's me, right? And the reason that I'm able to live in San Francisco on that kind of an income, which is not a lot of money, right, is that I got together and I found weird workarounds to achieve my personal goals in a profoundly dysfunctional landscape, right? So one of the solutions was, I was young. I didn't have a lot of money. I didn't want to get older and find myself in a position where I might be evicted, or I might just get priced out. And then like, what do you do when you just can't afford to live in the place you've built your life around? And I didn't want to be in that position. So I got together with a group of other friends who had the same situation. We were young. Nobody had a lot of money. And I said, if we pool our money, if we just take whatever we have and we put it together, we could afford to do something collectively that we could not do individually. And I identified a small apartment building. It's a 4-unit apartment building with 1 bedroom in each apartment and a little detached cottage in the back. So it's a 5-unit commercial property, apartment building. And we bought it collectively. And it's actually a lot cheaper to buy a whole building per unit than it is to buy just one apartment, right? Or to buy a single family home. So we actually got a bulk discount. And the problem, of course, was we had to get financing. And the bank didn't want to give us a loan. So we had to change the way we approached the situation. We went to the bank with a different pro forma. We said, we're investors. We want to be slumlords. And said, got it. Here's the forms. Let's do this. It cash flows. The loan is this much. This is what the market rents are. Boom, you're going to make money. Congratulations. And then we just moved in and we rented the units to ourselves. So we were both the tenants and the landlords. It was like a little loop, And that got us to own property in San Francisco for $900 a month, right? And it was like, that was the smartest thing any of us ever did. But we had to do it collectively, right? So one of the people who reads my blog reached out to me. She was in Maine, in a small town, and it was always a little bit pricier than what the locals could afford because it was money that would come in from Boston and New York, and but when the pandemic hit, that just exploded. And I'm talking to this woman, and I said, look, I just got onto Zillow, and there is a 3-unit building. It's about 100 years old. Back then, they would build enormous apartments. They were like 2,000 square feet. There was 3 stories, 1 apartment on each floor. 3-bedroom apartments, big enough to raise kids in, right? And it had 3-car garage and a decent sized yard. And it was in the town that she wanted to live in. And it said it's $500,000. Okay, it's a lot of money for one person. But if you have 2 friends, you take $500,000, you divide it by 3. That becomes a very affordable way to live in the town that you want to live in, right? And you're cherry picking your neighbors because you're going into this together, right? That's like a workaround. Now,
Right.
it's very specific. It's very particular. Right? She didn't want to do it. She said, no, that's weird. That's just too weird. I'm like, okay, good luck, because where you're going to end up is you're going to wind up renting or maybe owning some kind of like trailer park or townhouse condominium made out of vinyl and compressed dust out on the edge of the highway, 30 minutes away, because that's where you're going to wind up with your budget in that town. Right? Another thing about working around things is that in 2008, we had this massive economic crash. And that crash allowed me to buy property in Sonoma County, which I could never have otherwise afforded. And I found the smallest, most rundown, crappy old house on a beautiful half acre. And the neighbors have horses, and it's the country, and yet it's still close enough where we could walk or ride a bike to a little town where there's a post office and there's some restaurants, and it's walkable country living, with like a little hint of suburbia, but it's mostly farmland and stuff. And it was affordable because we had an economic crash. We're always going to have another economic crash. They come pretty regularly, and the more you try to stop them from happening, the bigger the crash is when it finally arrives. So there are opportunities for ordinary people to work around these things. And then because I was able to buy this little house, I began to implement the original green approaches. You just had Steve Mouzon on it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I'm not doing the solar panels and all the bells and whistles and the computer chips. And no, insulate it, put in really good windows, put on a metal roof to keep the heat off, shade the south and the west facades, keep the sun off of it. Right? And don't interact with the authorities. Don't go, because I actually have friends who are architects, and they'd come by and they'd look, oh, well, we could do this and we could do that. And I said, what the permit fee, the impact fees for an addition are going to be like $54,000 before you buy any lumber or hire a carpenter, like just out of just the pay. Like, and I'm like, no, we're not doing that. No. So there are ways that you can navigate the landscape that exists in a way, but you have to be patient and you have to be willing to do weird things.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things I really enjoy and encourage anybody to read about on your site is all the really, really clever and intelligent workarounds that you've taken and that you've seen others take over the years. I want to ask you a little bit about, so the original house, the 5-unit building that you bought in San Francisco. So just like a hyper specific thing. So did you have to form like a corporation as a group to buy that? And then what's the status of the situation now? Are the same people around? Or is the building paid off? What does that look like?
So it's a legal document that you draw up where you're essentially forming a mini corporation, right? It's like a co-op or a business. You're establishing a business, and the business is owning the building, and then there are people who own the business, right? So you're setting up a tiny corporation, and over time, what we did is we applied to the city to convert the building, which has one owner, which is the piece of paper that we're pretending is, a corporation, to turn it into condominiums. And that took us 11 and a half years because the bureaucracy is endless. But we're all still here. Nobody's left, right? Because you're living in a place for $900 a month when all around you the price is just going crazy, right? Why would any of us leave? Right? And then once we converted to condominiums with the city, then we each took individual mortgages. So now we have financial firewalls between us. Now, in the meantime, for the first 11 years, if any one of us didn't come up with our share of that payment, the others would have had to make it up. So there was a risk involved. It was me and it was Sam and it was Kevin and it was whatever. And if one of us didn't pay their share, the rest of us would have been liable for that. That didn't happen, but it could have. And you have to, when you're drawing up the documents, you have to think about all the contingencies. You have to sit down with a lawyer and say, okay, what happens if somebody dies? What happens if there's a divorce? What happens if somebody just doesn't want to be here anymore and they're going to move off? So you have to think about all the contingencies and say, okay, well, when that happens, this is our plan B, and it's all written down, and we already know what's going to happen next. Right? Once we went condo, then we didn't have that problem so much. Because then we have our own little mortgages and our own responsibilities. So if you want to die or get divorced, that's your problem, right? But nobody's left.
That's interesting. So
we're actually just growing old together.
It's still all the original group.
Yeah, nobody's gone.
Huh. Interesting.
Now, what it had done for us is that because we had capped our housing costs at a really good level, even though none of us were making that much money, it allowed us to save money. And that's why it was possible to buy a place in Sonoma when the opportunity presented itself, because we were actually being frugal. Right? What a lot of people, the normal trajectory is that you start out with a starter home, and then a few years go by, and then you get a bigger house, and then you feel like, oh, now I can afford a nice place. So now you're going to get, I'm going to go to the villas at Retention Pond Phase 4, and I'm going to live the life. And then what you're doing is you're adding debt to your life, because you're getting more stuff, and then you got to get the truck, and then you got to get the boat. But what we did is that we actually we thought, well, we're happy where we are. Let's just take that money that we're not spending and buy other properties in other places, and then you can rent those out at a profit, and then you've got more income coming in and more savings, and then you can buy another property. Like during the pandemic, I bought 2 more houses because I could. Again, not because I'm rich. I'm a nobody, but you live frugally. You get some extra incomes going on from other places, and that income provides more savings, which provides more income. And that's why I'm in Mexico City right now. I'm thinking about retiring. Yeah. And this is a really attractive retirement destination. So I'm here I'm about to get my immigration cards, and if I buy a property here, the dollar goes farther in Mexico, and I could wind up being crazy old man Sanphillippo, in Mexico City, and I might like that.
Yeah. So it's funny that you tell that story, because probably, I've made an awful lot of really dumb financial decisions in my life, but probably the smartest one I made was really the first property I bought here in Kansas City was actually a triplex. It was one of those, great old 1910 houses in an old neighborhood that was carved up into 3 apartments in the Great Depression, and stayed that way for a long time. And I was able to buy that at a pretty low price in the mid 1990s, and then kept that for quite some time. So that was almost like, it was like the Kansas City version, a little bit of what you were, talking about. But I think what you did is really clever, and it reminds me a lot of, so when I did that, and then the next house that I bought, I actually had a carriage house built behind it so that I could also have that rental income on it. And, 20 years later, all the kids call that house hacking, basically what you and I have done. And I've written a little bit about that. You've done it a lot in some really creative ways. Not so, in a sense, I would consider what you did with the original building. That's obviously a really smart form of house hacking in an urban area, but the house in Sonoma, and even the houses in Madison, are sort of a different version of it. You may not be living there, but they have the opportunity for you to live there. You've set them up in a way that you could, if you ever wanted to, you could potentially move to either of those places.
Well, I mean, Madison is the kind of town that I like. It's a small city, but it's the state capital. It's a university town. It's got medical centers. It's got some uh, tech companies that specialize in like healthcare and agriculture, because that's it's particular to Wisconsin. And there's neighborhoods that I know I could live in and be happy in. And also, I have family in Wisconsin, so
Yeah.
there's that. Would I rather be old in Mexico City compared to Madison? I think so. So the whole point of figuring out how to buy something in San Francisco when I was young and poor is that I didn't want to be vulnerable as I got older.
Yeah.
And the reason that I was excited about getting a place like 50 miles outside of the city in Sonoma was that if we had an earthquake, I would have a fallback position. Like, okay, the building was destroyed. That's a big problem. Even if you were fully insured, it takes a couple years minimum to rebuild, because everybody's rebuilding everything all at once. And like, good luck finding materials and labor and stuff. Then I realized that the forest fire situation in California is really escalating. And I realized that it might be that the Sonoma house is damaged, possibly in a fire or an earthquake, and then the city might be the thing I fall back on. Wisconsin, having a couple of rental properties in Wisconsin, it's another option. Like, I could fall back on that. And it could be that it's the revenue, it's the income that I can use to rent something else somewhere. Or it could be those houses specifically that I could move into if I needed to. And I would be okay. I'd be happy, like in one of those houses in Madison. Mm-hmm. And then if you add Mexico City, and then there was a house in rural Hawaii, by the way, which I had for 18 years, which I sold a few years ago. So that was another plan B, right? and now it's Mexico City, which is like, Mexico City has all sorts of vulnerabilities. Like there's earthquakes here, there's all kinds, but it's a different kind of problem in a different kind of place. And this probably won't be my last thing. Like, I'm already thinking about, once we get Mexico City sorted out, what's the next thing, right? And it's so I like covering my bases.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, where do you think that desire to have a lot of plan Bs comes from?
Poverty as a child. It's not complicated. I grew up in a family where every imaginable thing, anything that could go wrong, it went wrong. Yeah. Over and over and over again. Yeah. My mom was a wonderful woman and a great mother. And she really strove constantly to improve the condition of the family, but she had spectacularly bad taste in men. My father and then my stepfather, these guys were not, they were not interested in her plans. And I grew up constantly moving, like always one step ahead of the landlord, because they couldn't pay the rent. And then we finally settled down in suburban New Jersey, because my stepfather was in the Army and he got the house through the Veterans Administration programs. And I just watched that house fall apart. Like, just year after year, things broke and they never got fixed. And the house just physically fell apart as I grew up. And it was just, I said, I can't do this. This is not how I'm going to live my life. I left home when I was like 15. And so I walked away and I'm like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And I should have wound up dead like 20 times, but I didn't. Here I am. So why do I have a plan B? That's why.
Yeah. And a plan C and D and E, which is certainly.
And they're not all going to go wrong. One of them will still be okay. And I don't need that much to be happy. Yeah. If I'm in the right place with the right people, I'm good.
Yeah. It's interesting also, there's a community, which you probably know about now being in Mexico City, but there's a community of like Americans who, of all different ages, who basically are living either overseas or looking to live overseas, and especially interest in a lot of Latin American countries. I know Peru is really popular. Ecuador, I think, is really popular because
Hmm.
you can live there so inexpensively compared to the United States, and even healthcare is cheap. All sorts of things are incredibly inexpensive.
Yeah. I'm not here because it's cheap. I'm here because it's nice, but the fact that
Hmm.
it's affordable is a big plus.
Yeah.
Um, and I know that there was some bad press. I think the New York Times ran this article about how like American expats
Hmm.
are ruining Mexico.
Right.
And this is a city of 21 million people, and there are 10,000 Americans here.
Yeah.
Right? So like you can't 10,000 Americans can try really hard, but they're not going to ruin a 21 million people
Yeah.
city.
Yeah.
We're all clustered in a handful of neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods are getting affected. They're getting much more
Right.
expensive. The locals are getting squeezed out. It's gentrification. That's all a very
Hmm.
real thing, right? And not all of the Americans are well behaved, right? That's the other thing is you're in somebody else's country. Be gracious about it. Be
Yeah.
kind to people. Don't be a mucosa. Don't be a snot, right? But the thing is that there's as many people benefiting from the influx of Americans as there are people feeling the, the sharp end of that stick, because people are making money from us. You
Yeah.
know, like it. So it again. What are you gonna?
Yeah.
I don't worry about this stuff. I just don't.
Well, and I think that's one thing that in our back and forth is always interesting because I don't want to be reductive about it, but just for the sake of fun, sometimes our conversations become almost like the pessimist and the optimist. And again, it's not that's probably not a totally fair
Oh, I'll
accusation,
take.
but
I'll be the pessimist in this. Yeah. Oh, load me
yeah,
up. Yeah.
yeah. But and I'm
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 good at that.
usually the optimist, but not always. And
Yeah.
uh, so I think, and obviously one of the big sources of that back and forth is, I'm still in a world where I feel like I am trying to nudge people and trying to fix systems that aren't working and trying to, you know, make places better, blah, blah, blah. That's my daily life. And, and so we have kind of this interesting back and forth about you know, whether some things are fixable or not. And I I have found your perspective very interesting. Yet here I am still plugging ahead, still trying to fix zoning codes and development processes and everything else.
If somebody is paying you to bang your head up against the wall, that's fine, right? I mean, you're making a living. You're attempting to do things. You have successes. You have failures, but you're actually being paid to do the thing that you think you should be doing. That's fine. No one is ever going to pay me to do anything ever. I mean, like I've gone to the city hall meetings and I've tried to participate and I've talked to mayors and I've done this all over the country, and I am irrelevant. I'm not even irrelevant. I don't exist in their world. Like I'm the person that they already figured out how to gently handle, right? To oh okay yeah oh, I'm so glad you came. This is really important stuff you're telling me. No, they're just gently getting me out the door.
Yeah.
I'm wasting my time. Right? You show up. You have credentials. Somebody's paying you to do this stuff. Great, wonderful. You might transform Kansas City, and I hope you succeed. Uh, that's not my world.
Yeah.
I don't think about that. What I see happening, and you see this in Detroit, and I spent a lot of time in Cincinnati. I owned
Hmm.
a property in Cincinnati for
Yeah,
a short period of time.
I was going to ask you to mention the Cincinnati effort because I think it tied into all
Yeah,
this.
and I happen to really like Cincinnati. Like I had a whole big plan
It's a beautiful
built
city.
around Cincinnati
Yeah.
until I went into the meat grinder of the local institutions, and I said, "You don't want me here, and I'm leaving." And that was the end of that, right? Like
Hmm.
I'm not going to waste too much more time. But the thing about these places is that they've declined so much for so long that they're actually ripe for reinvention. That there are these Main Street town neighborhoods, or even early suburban neighborhoods from like the 20s or the 50s that are really well placed geographically because they're pretty close to the center of the city, and yet they're up against nature. There's a river and there's a forest reserve. They're kind of in a sweet spot. A lot of these neighborhoods that have really declined in a big way, and they were just incredibly cheap. And I thought, okay, if I move into this place, if I buy a property, I can do this and I can do that, and it could be like amazing. And then you realize that like the zoning regulations and the permit process and they're like they are not interested in your vision. They have a different vision, and it does not include you or any of your plans. And once I figured that out, I'm like, oh, I'm done. I can move on to someplace else that wants me, right? Because all I was going to do is take a little 700 square foot, one-story shotgun shack that was in really, really rough shape. It was a $16,000 house, right? Like it cost less than a car. And on either side of it and across the street and all up and down the block, there were two-story houses. And all I wanted to do was make it a two-story house, just like the houses all around it. And that was never going to happen. I spent a year and a half going all around the bureaucracies trying to get permission to do this. And I just realized like they're never gonna sign off on this. Why? Doesn't matter why. Don't care. You know? Sometimes doing nothing is the right thing. If I had just put a little lipstick on that pig, I could have waited a few years and sold it for a whole lot more money because the neighborhood was improving rapidly. Houses on that same block now sell for $400,000. Had I done nothing, I could have made a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that I had these like dreams, like, oh, I'm gonna improve it. It's gonna be really nice. It's gonna be great. Like that's where I went wrong. I've learned doing nothing is often the very best thing. And then you get criticized for that. Oh, so you're going to let other people do all the hard work and you're just going to benefit. And I'm like, yeah, that is a really good plan.
Well, especially
don't interact with the authorities.
Yeah. Well, especially as you mentioned, if you're just, a guy, if you're just a person that is, you're not part of a corporate entity or something like that, that it really is the best way to go and to look for those workarounds wherever you can.
Yeah.
So, what's next for you, Johnny? I mean, you'll be in Mexico for a little while, and then I guess at some point you'll come home. What's next?
Yeah, I'll go back home to San Francisco, and because I do actually have a life there. This Mexico is getting my paperwork in order. And by the way, immigrating to Mexico is actually really easy. If you're not a criminal, if you're not deeply impoverished, if you can show up and show that you're a respectable person who is more or less solvent. You don't have to be rich. You just have to not be totally broke. The Mexicans welcome you. Like, yes, please come here. That's fine. It's the ultimate reverse commute, right? And I'm going to be going back to this is just to get my paperwork in order and to start to focus on where exactly I would like to be in the future. And I'll come back, a couple times a year and work that out. I'm going to be going back to San Francisco, and I'm actually going to be spending most of this summer at the Sonoma House because the tenants who were living there left on February 1st. And I'm going to be bringing the house back. Every time tenants move out, I take some months and I make another round of improvements. Mm-hmm. So a lot of gardening stuff, a lot of landscaping stuff, a lot of exterior work. And I actually enjoy that. Like I'm really in my element when I'm painting and cleaning and planting trees and doing that stuff. And shuttling back and forth to work in the city and then going out to Sonoma. I'm kind of I'm 55. This is like semi-retirement for me, like puttering in the garden and going back to the city, and that's what I do.
Yeah,
it's a good spot to be in. Where I started from and where I am now. It's nice. You really feel the difference. You really notice, like, okay, I'm not broke anymore, and I'm not living in my car.
Yeah, no doubt. I can imagine that's an enormous difference. Well, I still got to get you to Kansas City sometime, and I've got a garden here that you can putter in as much as you would like, and plenty of work that needs to be done around the house. So,
would you and your family like to come and spend some time in the Sonoma House in San Francisco? Because we can accommodate you. We
absolutely,
have people all the time.
Absolutely, would love to do it. So, I think we should definitely make a plan to do that. So,
right. So I'm not like the bundle of sunshine telling everybody that everything is going to be okay. I think a lot of terrible things are going to happen, but I think you can navigate your way through it and arrive at a good spot. That's the takeaway.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It's great advice for a lot of people. It's also great advice for people who are trying to work on their own community. It's like have a realistic assessment of where things are and what's going to happen. There's going to be, like any time period in history, there's going to be bad things happen, but there's also great opportunities and opportunities for people to do good things and still live a good life. I've been a big fan of, what you've done and your website for a long time. And so why don't you remind everybody where to find you?
Granola Shotgun. Granola, like the cereal, shotgun, like the
Yeah.
firearm.com. That's it.
And real quickly, what was the genesis for the name?
I noticed that people who don't like each other were much more alike than they realized. Like if you take like a cartoon liberal from Marin County, which is a very crunchy granola type place, and you take someone from like Orange County, which is like super Republican conservative, the shotgun, and you look at actually the things that they care about and the things they insist on, they're exactly the same things. It's
Yeah.
like neither one of those people wants poor people living in their neighborhood. If you live in $1 million house, you don't want an $800,000 house on your block because that's beneath you, and you don't want those trashy people sending their kids to the same school as the school your kids go to. There was no difference. It's
Yeah.
granola shotgun.
Yeah.
It's convergent evolution, and nobody noticed.
Well, that's perfect. Well, thanks, Johnny. Really appreciate this. We'll do it again sometime.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.